So our next panel, very excited. It's been a number of years since we've had an associate administrator panel. We used to have them every other year prior to COVID, but we took a little break on that even prior to COVID. So to lead this panel, we have Matt Kaplan, who all of you know is the former host of Planetary Radio, senior advisor, communications advisor at the Planetary Society. And as you know, Matt has been one of our reliable and expert co-host for the Humans to Mars Summit. We can't remember when. It was sometime in the mid-teens, but nobody can seem to remember the first year. It's been lost to the ages, but sometime in the last 10 years, you started helping us with this. So thank you very much, Matt. So,
thank you, Chris. Have a seat, everyone. I assume that is for the very distinguished panel that I'm honored to bring out today. I guess it's a good sign of the respect that Humans to Mars and Explore Mars has generated over the years with these summits and all of its other work. Because, we started with Bob Cabana yesterday, and now we have 3 more of the people who work right under the administrator and make this amazing agency, America's greatest brand, NASA, do the great work that it does. To start, to my immediate left, Nicola, Nikki Fox, of the Science Mission Directorate, then Jim Free, who is the it's a long one, ESDMD, Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, and Jim Reuter, who is, there's something special that has to be said here, Space Technology Mission Directorate, of course. But, what was it? 2 weeks ago, I think I got the release from NASA that you are ready to retire after over 40 years with the agency, rising to Associate Administrator. So, congratulations and thank you, Jim. And please.
I guess I don't have Mike, but I do want to say thank you. I really appreciate the sentiment. But what I would say is, I think you said I announced I was ready to retire. The better way to say it, a more accurate way to say it is probably that I've decided to retire. We'll decide. We'll determine whether I'm ready.
Okay, coming soon. And we may come back to that because I may want to hear about some highlights from you. It's not, strictly speaking, the title or fit the theme of this particular session, but I have to ask because it's what we're talking about overall. And we're following that panel of experts on can we get humans to Mars, or at least around Mars, by 2033. Can we put footprints on Mars by 2040? I'll throw it out to all of you. Nikki?
Oh, I think we're certainly very supportive of doing it. We're doing all the pre-work that we can to do it, but I think that would be a bit ambitious, Jim.
Yeah, you've heard our Deputy Administrator talk about 2039 mission, and I think when we back that up and connect it with what we're trying to do on the moon, that is going to be tough. We have to start launching things in probably 2032, 2035. To head out to the moon, to pre-position things for the crew with the current architecture that we would have in place. We also need some time to learn on the moon in that reduced gravity environment of how our systems work, including our human systems. So it absolutely is aggressive to do that, but that's the timeline that I worry about, and getting stuff done in time to meet those launch dates.
And I'd say that is an audacious goal. For us to meet. I think and as Jim said, and what 2039 implies is that you really start the transit there, the logistics train, in the early 2030s. So the audaciousness of the 2033 discussion you just had is about when you'd have to start accomplishing that. And for me, we run technology, so a big part of this is, well, do we have the technologies ready for that? And 2039. Well, okay, that's 17 years or 16 years from now. It may sound like a lot, but it's a very short time in terms of many of the technologies that we need to develop are really need to be going now strongly. So
you've already brought up something that I wanted to mention, and I kind of puzzle over why we still have some people asking why the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. Why don't we just go straight to Mars? I would think by now anybody who's really looked at this would know. Let's get our feet wet or dusty on the moon, before we tackle the red planet. I'm I think I'm right about that, yeah?
I mean, I think that's where I was going with we need some time to understand,
Yeah.
right? If I take the ISS analogy, we used the ISS to we tested systems for the ISS on the ground, and then we launched them, and I think the gentleman to my left here had something to do with it, and we learned that they stopped when they got in microgravity for a variety of reasons, the fluid behavior, whatever it might be. So we learned that lesson on ISS of the analog. So we don't want to go right to Mars and then have everything gunk up, to use a technical term, and not having tested it on the moon. But the connectivity for the moon to Mars is important of the systems, but don't lose sight of what there is to learn scientifically on the moon. So we're going to go and test our human systems, but our priority is to do the science that we can do on the moon that's outlined by Nikki and by the Moon to Mars objectives as well. So they're connected system-wise, but I think don't overlook the science as well.
Jim Free, I'm going to stick with you, but please, everybody jump in as you wish. It's only been, 6-7 weeks since I got the press release about the creation of the Moon to Mars Program Office, which seems like it very much fits the theme of this session, the collaboration that is going to be absolutely necessary among your directorates and others if we're going to have success in all of this. Can you tell us a little bit about that office and how it represents that collaboration?
Sure. So we actually have kind of 3 offices that report to the Associate Administrator, currently me. One is our Strategy and Architecture Office, which is really tasked with planning the long-term missions. So you think Artemis 6 and out, they're really focused on that architecture, connecting Moon to Mars. And then the Moon to Mars Program Office is really down and in, think near-term missions, Artemis 5 and Artemis through Artemis 2. Now, but they both have interfaces to these 2 mission directorates, both of those offices I talked about. So we want to plan that strategy and architecture with technology infusion in mind, with science in mind. And then the Moon to Mars Program Office, those near-term missions. How are we running the technology that's on there, and how are we doing the science? But the scope of that office, Moon to Mars, I think is important because the Mars element of that office is pulling the technologies. It's providing requirements to the lunar missions, to the lunar systems, to develop the hardware that we need and keep that connectivity, so we're not developing a life support system that has no connectivity to what we want to use on the surface of Mars or on the way to Mars. So the scope of that office is great for that reason, but it's also very much focused on the near-term missions to get it done.
And I'll add, I guess, that for us, when Jim formed the Moon to Mars Program Office, Strategy and Analysis Office, it really aligned us well with our key customers to us, and it gives us a path towards understanding the key technology gaps we have to satisfy, and which ones of those is highest priority, because we can't afford to fund everything, so we've got to be really judicious about what we do and do as much with partnerships as we can.
Yeah, and for the science, I mean, I think it gives us a really easy interface into the other mission directorate. And we're scientists. We want to do everything, everywhere, all of the time. And these missions, it's a place to really get the requirements ironed out and who's responsible for them and what's actually possible on the various missions. Obviously, we're starting kind of early. We're sending our CLIPS landers to the moon with commercial partners, and they'll be starting to launch later this year. We're really excited about that. So we're working on that, but we're also looking at what we can do with Artemis 2. Obviously, we had science on Artemis 1. We had the biological and physical science inside the Orion capsule itself. So what are we going to do with Artemis 2? And then, for me, it's what's the really exquisite science that we're going to do with astronauts who can actually make decisions right there. And so, really thinking it's just really kind of focusing our efforts and giving us a partner to really kind of iron these things out with.
We got a lot of great science out of Apollo, still getting great science out of Apollo.
Yes.
But, there was always that push and pull between we got to get the astronauts there and back safely, and, how much science can they do? They were all pretty busy on the moon. How has that evolved? I got to tell you something that struck me yesterday when we had a SpaceX representative on stage who said that the crew compartment in the Starship lander is about double the size of this stage. And I thought, ooh, that's room for a lot of science.
Yes. That's exactly what I would think too. I mean, I think there's still going to be that push and pull. I mean, you have astronaut safety, you have to get them there safely and back home safely, and that's obviously the prime objective. But making sure that we're using the time while they're there most effectively. If anyone doubts the real need to bring samples back from whichever destination, we're still doing amazing science with the Apollo samples. And I was out at Johnson a couple of weeks ago and was able to actually tour the labs where they do all the experiments. And you see these just huge mass spectrometers. There's no way you could fly that to the moon or fly that to Mars. So you bring the samples back and you have your incredible equipment here. But also if you just compare the type of equipment we had even here on Earth 50 years ago with what we have now, you can keep those samples and you can mature your technology and do more and more and more with those samples. So, there will still be doing a lot more with Apollo samples for decades to come. And as we bring samples back from Mars, clearly I'm excited about bringing samples back from Mars, there's going to be just decades and decades of work with those Mars samples and more samples from the moon. First time we're going to the South Pole, it's going to be the very different types of samples we'll be bringing back.
No better example than those lunar samples brought back by Apollo of the gifts that keep on giving. It was also just recently that I saw, I'm looking forward to my notes so I can get it right, the announcement within the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute of 5 more teams that have been selected to do more science on the moon, and once those samples are brought back here. And I know that this is, Jim Free, this is a collaboration between your directorate and Nikki's. It seems like this also represents the kinds of collaboration we're seeing within the agency.
Absolutely. I think it's essential that we maintain that connectivity to science in everything that we do. That's been a funding source, I think, that's been around since Bill Gerstenmaier was the AA, because when I was his deputy, I remember that. But I think it's important to enable the science however we can, and at every level. It's not just about, for us, it's our big international partners, providing elements. It's making science available to everyone. To Nikki's answer to Nikki's last question, to add to that, we're going there. We have to establish a human presence to test the systems, but we're doing it to enable science. And we enable science through the samples we bring back. Nikki, I know, develops that with the science definition teams that she puts together. It's great inroads at every level for folks to take advantage of that science and what we're able to provide in samples.
Yeah, and I'll also note, our biological and physical sciences division, they're starting out on something called CIRRUS, which is commercially enabled rapid space science. And, looking at what they're doing with that right now, we send an experiment up to space, you wait, you get your samples back and then you test it. What they're doing with this is really looking at just accelerating the science. So scientists, astronauts would actually then be preparing samples, doing the testing, making the determination, do we want to do it differently? And so we'll be taking years off some of the timescales for the science we can do as well.
I'll add to that too, actually, because we're really excited about the survey teams that have been formed, because we have a lot of touch points. If one of the key things we're trying to do in terms of understanding how we can take advantage of the resources of the moon and process it is to really understand what they are and the prospecting things and so on. So I think we have our Lunar Service Innovation Consortium, and I think we'll have strong touch points with the survey as they come forward.
That takes me right to the next question I was hoping to ask you to talk to you about, and that's the kinds of things the most critical steps in terms of preparing to do the science, but also the technology demonstrations that the moon is going to enable for us, and Gateway is going to enable for us, that we really have to see. I know we're partway there, right? There's been good progress, but we still have a ways to go before we can get humans to Mars and back safely.
I mean, I would say I talked about the systems on the surface that we can test and use at Mars. Gateway's incredibly important. We can run analog missions from Mars, analog missions from Gateway. So we can send the crew there, have them spend 6 months on Gateway, and some of our later expeditions out there, and like they're flying to Mars for 6 months and get deconditioned as you do in microgravity, then send them down to the lunar surface for 30 days, have them operate, test themselves out, and then come back to Gateway and stay for 6 months, and then come back to Earth. So we can simulate a Mars mission from microgravity to partial gravity back to microgravity, which will help inform how the human responds, but we'll be doing science all the way through that. And we'll need the technologies that Jim and his team are developing to make that happen. Some of the advanced ECLS from radiation protection, as an example of things that really drive our systems. So I think the connection is clearly there for me.
Jim, I mean, that's a great example, radiation. You'd be outside the Van Allen belts.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a lot like a trip to Mars.
Yeah,
on
it
Gateway.
absolutely is, and there's a lot we'll learn from Mars. Some of the technologies that we have working on is, the Gateway, the propulsion elements of the Gateway, the electric thrusters are an advanced size design that we actually have just delivered the qualification unit as part of our development for activity for it. The solar arrays that will power the Gateway is a long time development that we had in technology that has on the rollout solar arrays that are now also the replacement arrays for station used in missions and as well as Gateway. When you look at the surface, there's so many things that we're going to be doing there and operating and establishing an infrastructure is one of the key elements that you can do in terms of establishing a base here or a foothold on Moon, and then that activity is understanding how we do that from Mars. Reliable power source, the life support, and advanced habitation systems, and all these sort of things we can learn a lot from being on the Moon first.
Whole new technologies that are in development, not only across directorates, but across NASA centers. One of my favorite people on Earth, Rob Manning, the chief engineer at JPL, love to talk with him and sit and watch videos of him, of tests of parachutes and aeroshells being tested in Earth's atmosphere, and then just watching his reaction, which he almost is delighted when they get shredded. But I mean, very promising technology, one that some of your staff people have talked about. And I'm thinking of this program called, is it LOFTID? Am I saying it correctly? Low Earth Orbit Flight Test of an Inflatable Decelerator?
I'm sure you're glad you told me what the name was, because I could never remember it. Yes. I think we've had in development an inflatable heat shield to help land through the hypersonic deceleration for missions. When you get missions, you're trying to land extremely large cargo in any planet that has an atmosphere, including Earth. The big challenge is how do you do that slow down? And you need a lot of drag area. One of the best ways to get a drag area is to have it be an inflatable. So back on November 10th, we flew in a public-private partnership with ULA, no exchange of funds. They contributed their part, we contributed ours. It's a potential for large return to Earth activities, as well as Mars. And for us, we've got to find those kind of partnerships as we go forward. So anyways, we flew on the JPSS-2 mission. We were a ride share for that. So after the JPSS-2 completed its mission, it was Atlas V out of Vandenberg. Then we were released, and we did the demonstration of an inflatable decelerator back to Earth, and it could not have worked better. As we went through it, extremely stable. We saw the inflation. Extremely stable. It landed right where it was supposed to, just off the coast of Mars. We were hoping, we had an ejectable data recorder that we ejected before we got to the ground, because that would be something we knew would float and would have a beacon. But we were hoping to recover the whole unit, the whole system, which we did. It landed within a few miles of where our boat was and stuff. So, and when you look at it, the shell itself, the aeroshell itself, inflated shell, looks almost pristine, like you could just fly it again.
Wow.
The only place that there was damage was at the nose cap. The thermal protection system up there had some water damage when it hit.
We also heard a little bit about aeroshell development from a JAXA representative yesterday, since they also see great promise in this, which I should go straight to talking about international collaboration. But before I do, I mentioned the centers collaborating with each other and among the directorates as well. Talk about how critical that is to doing science on Mars and putting footsteps up there, footprints.
So, I mean, it kind of ties to the centers as well as the international, but I mean, if you look at something as ambitious as Mars sample return, we're doing that with a lot of partners. There's obviously, many centers at NASA with JPL, Goddard, and Marshall, all producing really critical pieces for Mars sample return, but also, we have full partnership with the European Space Agency. We are flying some of our NASA hardware on their orbiting system. They're providing a robotic arm on the actual lander that we'll put down that NASA's designing. So, it's really critical that we have these really tightly coupled partnerships. The same, we're making contributions to their Rosalind Franklin mission as well. So, I think it's in the whole spirit of our exploration and the Artemis Accords moving forward. We just have just innate collaboration, yes, between the NASA centers, but also out into the world.
Science side, but also, I think of maybe the most obvious example of the kind of global collaboration, Artemis Accords, but there are even deeper relationships than that. I'm thinking of that ESA service module for Orion, which did a pretty good job not long ago, right?
Yeah, it absolutely performed. All the vehicles performed well, all elements of the vehicles. The ESA service module absolutely did, with a lot of subsystems, propulsion, power, cooling. On Artemis 2, it'll have all the gases and liquids for the crew. So, but we build only from there. You talked about Gateway. We have the International Hab that will fly on Gateway. That's part of that. The Esprit refueling module that's going to be on there. JAXA actually built the ECLSS, is building the ECLSS for the IHAB module. We're obviously working with other countries, the Japanese on the pressurized rover. The Canadians announced that they have approved for a medium-sized utility rover that we'll be working with. We're flying a Canadian crew member on our first crew. And we have a whole number of partnerships in work as well on study agreements talking about how folks can participate big and small. It's not just about the multi-billion-dollar elements. The Germans and the Israelis flew the radiation vest on Artemis 1.
Yes,
I think you talked about that, right? So science collaboration, international science collaboration, great themes. All the CubeSats that we flew that had science on them, as well as international. And it really transcends the Accords. So the Accords are great in terms of they're thematic about how we're going to operate, how we're going to share data. And then there's how do people participate in the individual missions, sharing science being one of them. We have partners like the Israelis and the Australians who've taken our objectives, which I hope we can talk about a little bit too, and taken them and given them to their industry and say, hey, respond how you can be part of these objectives. So it's building off of their participation in the Accords that now moves over to the programmatic side.
But I'll just add, we're also doing a lot of interagency collaborations as we go through it. You had a session yesterday, I think, here that talked about our agreement with the recent agreement we had with DARPA on the Draco flight demonstrator for a nuclear thermal propulsion system. We're really excited about that, and while NASA and DARPA are the major players there, there's also roles outlined for Space Force and DOE, and I'm forgetting one. But anyways, it's a multi-agency activity, and we're looking for more of those as we go forward.
Industry participation, already come up, commercial side, has been a pretty notable success in recent years. Can you talk a little bit more about how these relationships have evolved and are also going to help us get out to the red planet?
For us, obviously, we're building off the success of commercial cargo and commercial crew, and those models that have been put in place. We're buying services for our landers. So our first 2 lander awards were to SpaceX for the first lander for Artemis 3, and then their more sustainable lander. And we have a competition that will make the announcement here very
Tomorrow?
soon.
You're among friends. Care to tip us
Well,
off?
no, it's out there now, so yeah, tomorrow. For our other lander provider, which is a service, we're buying our spacesuits as a service as well, which has started off good for us. And then we're looking at things like our lunar terrain vehicle, our unpressurized rover, to buy as a service also. We had our draft RFP about that. So it's going well. I mean, there's challenges. We all see that we need Starship to launch and be successful, to be successful for our first lander. It's a great process. It's a good contract structure in terms of cost savings, but we still need to hit schedule. And that's what's driving me right now, is hitting schedule. And buying services, no matter what we're getting. But those are the 3 I'd highlight as our prime examples.
Nikki, you started to address this with commercial participation in science activities. Expand on that.
Yeah, so we have a couple. So one is obviously the CLIPS, the commercial lunar payload that we're sending to the moon. So we've actually been touring and visiting some of our providers, the industry partners who are actually providing the landers. It's really cool to actually see the lander and see the science on the side of it. But really looking forward to getting those up to schedule to go this year. Many more to schedule to go after that. Going to very challenging areas. I mean, things like landing at the South Pole, landing in total shadow and having to survive the night. There's some pretty exciting things. One that will be like, these are sort of the tech demos that Jim might talk more about, but one that's actually going to hop. So it'll land and then it'll hop into the shadow, and then the plan is anyway it'll hop back out again. They're just really, really cool things that we're doing, and we're taking advantage of maturing these commercial capabilities, but putting science on them wherever we go. And so also as we transition from the ISS to commercial LEO destinations, starting to plan what can we do with these sort of new facilities. And I mentioned Cirrus as one example of actually being able to do science sort of on the spot, as opposed to having to take years, but even looking at what we can do with biological and physical sciences. Can we put some of those experiments on CubeSats and launch them, as Jim said, launch them with Artemis or launch them with one of our other commercial providers, instead of always waiting for an opportunity on ISS? Can we take advantage of some of these other commercial partnerships just to get more science into space? That's my goal, is more science into space. So taking advantage of every single piece of the Moon to Mars initiative. So starting with the ISS, commercial lunar destination, flying stuff in Orion, putting experiments on the Gateway. We have external payloads on the Gateway, looking at what kind of science can be done inside the Gateway. Then we've got CLIPS going to the lunar surface. Then we've got astronauts going to the lunar surface. We've got Mars sample return. We're sort of making sure science is in every, taking advantage of every single opportunity to do science.
I can't wait for. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, you can finish your thought. I was just
Well,
going
I'm
to
just
add
going to say, I can't wait for those spacecraft to reach the South Pole and start digging down to that wet stuff. That's going to be so cool.
We're excited for it too. What I'll say is we're increasingly pushing for partnerships in the investments we make, which isn't always intuitive when you're working with technology developments, sometimes at a very low technology readiness level. But it is an exciting time to be working in space with all the interest in investments as we go forward. So, and Nikki alluded to it, we have a tipping point and some announcement of collaborative opportunities, or ACO type solicitations that we do about every other year. And we've just recently announced our ACOs, and we're about ready to announce our tipping point selections. But these are very, oftentimes key technology developments that we would demonstrate as part of it on the moon. An example of that is the Intuitive Machines second mission. As we go through it, is actually pretty much almost all a technology mission. And Nikki alluded to the hopper that goes a mile at a time or something around the surface, hops into a permanent shadow region and can hop out and stuff. With that, we are demonstrating 4G LTE network, a wireless network on the moon. And we also have the first demonstration of a drill looking for ice water as we go through it. That same drill, or a second copy of that drill, is going to fly on the Viper mission that Nikki leads and stuff. So and we have all kinds of places like that in cislunar space as well. We flew the Capstone mission as a way to get to the NRHO orbit early, and we had a goal of a couple of years ago of let's come up with a way to fly a CubeSat in the NRHO orbit that Gateway does, and do that in enough time that it can help influence things. And it's now spent 120 or so days on the moon, at the moon, in the orbit and stuff. It's working extremely well now, and is in actually the experiment phase of autonomous navigation as we're going through it. So we have lots of examples, and they're very strong examples of the industry, academia, and the government working together.
Yeah.
Probably know we're kind of partial to CubeSats at my organization, so.
But I actually think that the tech demos that we're doing with CLIPS, I mean, I know I'm supposed to get excited about the science, but the tech demos are really cool, and there's something on every single one.
We're trying.
The advanced solar arrays, and then the precision landing, which is going to be so cool. I mean, so things like doing the precision landing with a CLIPS lander that is going to immediately help and inform as we do things moving forward.
I'll just add one more that's kind of a nice example like that is the terrain relative navigation system that we flew on Mars Perseverance to land accurately in the Jezero crater. What we've done since then is we developed it for that in concert with science. And then what we've done since then is develop a commercialized product, or the industry has developed a commercialized product that we've helped them with. And so they're flying, that technology is now flying on some of these CLIPS landers.
We are only about 5 minutes, maybe less, away from opening this up so that you can ask your questions of our 3 associate administrators. So be thinking about that, and if you want, start getting lined up there. But before we do that, I want to see if any of you have other examples you want to bring up that represent the collaboration that really we are supposed to be addressing in this session, across directorates or elsewhere.
Golly, there's so many. I mean, I think Jim did a really nice job of just, we've got partnerships with everybody. I mean, it's commercial, it's academia, it's industry. I mean, it's going to take those kind of partnerships and those kind of relationships to do these big, hairy, audacious goals that we want to do. And there are, I think honestly, it will be hard to think of an example that doesn't include a really, really important, critical partnership. In every aspect.
I'd highlight the architecture that we just rolled out a couple weeks ago. We have the Moon to Mars objectives, the 63 objectives that were developed by the entire agency, developed by the mission directorates. We have the document that explains those that came out just a week or so before the architecture, talks about the meaning behind each one. Then we have our architecture definition document, which is we and ESDMD have the responsibility to shepherd through, but it's developed with all the mission directorates. And then the specific elements that come out of that architecture are collaborations between all of us. So from the strategy at the objectives level to the implementation, I said publicly several times, I'm so proud of the fact that we can connect our strategy to requirements. There's not a lot of companies that can do that, let alone a government agency. And is it perfect the first time out? Probably not, but this is a yearly process we're going to go through, and we go through it as a group, all the mission directorates together, and the centers, by the way, to your earlier point.
Yeah, and even just the sort of cross-pollination between the various tracks that we had. So there's a science track, there's a sustainability, there's the transportation, and we were all kind of dropping into one another's all the way through to just make sure that, you're taking advantage of it, or you understand what the other ones are doing. And so, that was just kind of seamless even as we were putting the architecture together.
And I'll add on or pile on to the activities on the Moon to Mars objectives and the ADD and that sort of activity. We did ourselves, we've been developing over the last few years, is our way to help guide our investment strategy. And we call it our strategic technology framework that we developed. And with that, we were developing objectives and as in parallel basically to the activity on the moons of Mars, and it mapped extremely well. We were able to do that really well. So now naturally there's some things, Moon to Mars objectives are broader than just technology items, much broader, but also our scope is more than just Moon to Mars. It's supporting the other science missions and multiple other places. So it's not a complete one-to-one, but everything that we have, it maps really well. And then with the Moon to Mars objectives and the follow-on technology gaps, then we can feed that into our investment strategies go forward.
Jim Reuter, you don't quite go far enough back to be able to say you were there for Apollo when it was pretty much, we're going alone at NASA, if you ignore some rather large cost-plus contracts. Can you even imagine today taking on the goals, the objectives that are currently in place at NASA without doing the sorts of collaborations that you've been describing? Nikki?
No, I really can't. We certainly go together as we return to the moon, and I think that's a really important thing that we're doing. It's also really great. I mean, it's great to be collaborating and actually having a lot of the new partners, people that are new to space, and that's something we've been kind of helping with in the Science Mission Directorate is finding new ways for some emerging partners to come in and do something meaningful and kind of grow their space capabilities too. So it's just no, I can't imagine it, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
Don't want to imagine it either.
Jim Free?
I can't imagine it at all. We just had Space Symposium where we met with all of our international partners because everybody's there, so it's a great chance to meet with everybody. I have the privilege of really going around the world working with all of our international partners on their future plans, seeing their excitement. If I just look at the excitement of having a Canadian astronaut on the crew, by the way, the crew's in DC today and tomorrow.
And what a great guy, Jeremy Hansen.
Yeah, fantastic. But you see the enthusiasm that the entire crew brings, but one astronaut from that country, it shows you the excitement that it brings and the really commitment around the world to work together. So I can't even imagine it, nor could I imagine trying to afford it all ourselves either. There's a practical nature to this, but it is truly about going together for all humanity this time.
Jim?
Oh, I'll just say I don't really need to add on to that. That was great. But there's no way. This is the only way we could do it. We would not succeed if it wasn't for together.
My boss, the science guy, Bill Nye, he says a lot of cool things, but one of the things he says is that space brings us together and brings out the best in us. And this seems to be a great example of what that's capable of. Let's go out to you folks. I don't see anybody at microphones yet, but we're ready for your questions. Hi.
Hi, Eric Antonson, Baylor College of Medicine. Thank you very much for this talk. It's been fascinating. One of the things, if you've been watching NASA for the last few years, is there's a significant shift towards commercial services contracts in the way that you've handled your business. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of that and also some of the challenges that you've found? I believe CLIPS is a commercial services contract now, and it seems to be a changing business model over the last decade.
Yeah.
I mean, CLIPS is a great example. It's certainly enabling. It's enabling us to get more science onto the moon. It's enabling technology developments. There are challenges, for sure. It's the first time we're really doing these things. Certainly my predecessor, Thomas, said, we don't expect all of them to succeed. We're willing to sort of reach out and if some don't work, they don't work, but it's part of doing business. Certainly we want them all to succeed, and this is landing on the moon. It's not easy. So there are definitely challenges in just, even practices and best practices and different ways of, that we would normally do missions and, the challenge of even integrating science. But there's certainly challenges, but I'm hoping it's going to be worth it when that first CLIPS lander touches down on the moon.
Gentlemen?
I'd just highlight maybe a little bit more what I said earlier, the commercial cargo and commercial crew. I look at what that has enabled to bring launches back to the U.S. It obviously enables a lot for us on space station, but brought that back to the U.S. The three I mentioned, suits, landers, and LTV, those are markets that don't exist today, and we're buying services in them. So we're trying to enable services so that it enables other things, perhaps on the lunar surface, elsewhere in space as well. But on the lunar surface, our ultimate goal is to not be the only one there and seeing commercial on the surface. So we're hoping that the trend of commercial cargo and crew, and now with what we're trying to do, enables things further.
And I'll just add, I think that whenever you create an environment that encourages innovation in order to get ahead, and in the process being competitive, it brings out the best almost all the time.
And apologies for constantly pulling that tissue out. It's spring in DC, and I'm not used to this. I'm a California kid, so it's getting to me. Hi, sir.
Hi, Bruce Drukowski, University of Colorado.
Oh, it's Bruce. Hi, Bruce. There's an explorer of the solar system. So
Let me follow up with a question to Nikki on the CLIPS comments. Can you envision a scenario where a Mars equivalent commercial type of partnership might work?
And you want to say anything about the Maven mission while we're at it? So.
Go Maven.
Yeah, go Maven.
Yes, Maven is going strong. I mean, we haven't planned for that. I think we'll probably see how the model works on the moon. I'm kind of taking a leaf out of Jim's comments of we hone things on the moon and then we move them to Mars. I think we'll have to see how successful it is at the moon, but I certainly could envisage doing that type of thing and seeing how we can put more infrastructure on Mars. We're getting back to what both of my colleagues said about, we need to be, if we're going to do humans to Mars in 17 years, we'd have to be really starting to think about the infrastructure that we'd have to have in place for them at Mars. But it's certainly something to consider, but I do want to see how well we do at the moon first.
Thank you.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Maven, helping us to understand where all that air went on Mars that, once upon a time had Mars much more looking like Earth than it does now. Any other questions? Well, feel free to step up. There is one other kind of collaboration, which I'm going to go back to that announcement from the Institute that you collaborate on, and it's the collaboration between humans and robots. And asking you, how essential is that going to be as the humans are right there with the robots helping to get the work done?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it, I mentioned the Canadian utility rover. That's an example where that will work autonomously when the crew's not there, but can follow the crew along. The crew can only carry so much with them when they leave the habitat or the lander or the LTV. We can have the robots going with them to carry things with them or carry them back. We want to take some of the samples and keep them at cryogenic, I'll say cold temperatures. Cryogenic's going to be a whole new reach, but we want to keep them cold so that we can preserve as many of the volatiles that we can in the sample. And getting them back in a condition that we can use them as we go through all the chain of custody as we're starting to talk about it. That starts on the moon, and we can have them work closely with the astronauts. We can have robots scout, and the astronauts control them, much like you see, soldiers controlling drones today. We can help them explore without taking risks, perhaps down into a permanently shadowed crater. So to me, it's both a safety and a science return that benefits those two working together.
And I'll say, Moon is an obvious place because there's a lot of the crew will come in and out, people will come in and out, but there'll be activities that we want to extend to. But at Mars, actually, if you think about it, almost any scenario getting to Mars pre-positions a lot of supplies and logistics or creates fuel, and all that would have to be done robotically as we go through it before the crew is there.
We had anybody else come in? Hi there.
Hi, Crystal Puga, mission architect with Northrop Grumman. So I think we all agree that the moon is laying the foundation for getting us to Mars. And there's a component of the moon where we're continuing to evolve. We can continue to do more science. We can grow our habitat, add modules. But at what point does continuing to evolve and learn on the moon become a detriment to getting us to Mars? Or do you think that we can handle to run both in parallel?
Interesting.
I defer to the scientists for the science side of things, but from a practical aspect, we want to set it up so that the work on the moon continues. And if, again, I go to the ISS and the commercial LEO destination model, we'd love to see that model happen on the moon, where we're obviously a strong upfront investor, and I say we with all our international community, and we'd love to see that continue on with others doing things on the moon that they like to do, but we can still benefit from. And maybe we're not flying an entire vehicle there like we will be for the foreseeable future, but we can buy services, we can send our crews there and live in someone else's habitat or go somewhere else on the surface so that we can afford also to go on the moon. So go on to Mars. So I think off of the moon. So I think it's this balance of everybody wants to say, when do we stop at the moon? The answer is we don't stop at the moon. We continue working on the moon and doing science on the moon while we go on to Mars. We're just hopeful that the business model changes like we're trying to do in ISS and commercial LEO destinations today.
Reuter.
Yeah. Sorry.
Did-
So from a science point of view, there's always going to be science to do on the moon. I mean, you think of any destination you go to, there's always, you get more questions than you get answers with every single thing you do. And, we've got really strong, obviously, lunar science we want to do, but there's also astrophysics we can do from the moon. There's heliophysics, learning about the ancient sun. I mean, there's so much to do and so many places to explore that I certainly don't think from a science perspective it will hold us up. And we're already doing amazing science on Mars, which actually, if anything, wants me to accelerate being able to do more. I'm sure you all saw the Perseverance results earlier. I can't remember if it was earlier this week or last week, with the taking the rock sample that's clearly been sort of washed down from a different region, showing that we've had flowing water on Mars, and that just makes me absolutely desperate to go to Mars right now, actually, and go and find out what's going on. But I think from a science point of view, whatever we study, we get more questions than answers every time we do it.
I think a key question that the Moon to Mars objectives try to answer is it's not Moon or Mars, it's Moon and Mars.
Correct.
And so for us, a key part of is to create an environment, as Jim talked about, that's a sustainable presence on the moon. The sustainable presence does not mean NASA going once or twice a year. It's that we're enabling the entire community across the world to be able to go and take advantage of that.
Are you going to get a big radio telescope someday on far side?
I'm sure somebody's going to propose one.
I know, NIAC, there seem to be 3 or 4 every year proposals for building those things out in radio silence. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I don't see anybody at the microphone, so Jim Reuter, I'm going to come back to you, as I said I would. Looking back over your more than 4 decades, highlights, things you're most proud of, and what are you most looking forward to as you watch what happens after your exit?
Yeah, well, first thing I'll say is Robert Lightfoot, when he retired from NASA, said he was going to run through the tape. I'm going to run through the tape, and then, so my focus is really on executing my job over the next month and a half or so. I've been at NASA, my 40-year anniversary was just a couple weeks ago. And that means I've been at NASA for a little over 60% of NASA's existence. When I came to NASA, we had just flown the 6th shuttle mission out of the 135. And that 6th one was the first shuttle mission that was after Columbia. It was Challenger, as we go through it. So I had the privilege of working, a lot of places around the agency, mostly in human spaceflight. During those early formative years, it was working payload integration on shuttle. I was part of the International Space Station from the start to the time we went permanently occupied and running the life support systems as we went through that. After Columbia, I was brought in a leadership position to help figure out how to keep foam on a tank. And then over the last 8 years, I've had the extreme privilege of working in space technology, with the last 5 years leading it. So, I just can't say enough how lucky I am on the best place to work. But what I would say in terms of exciting me, I don't know that there's ever been a more exciting time in space than now. I mean, FY22 was an incredible year for NASA and you know, for the world. But just the breadth of the types of things we're doing, the interest and engagement of industry and academia, other international agencies and internationals themselves, it's just, we've never had that before, and it's one of the most exciting things I think that we do, is working it together. It always boils down to the people you work with. Thank you.
Thank you for your service. I look to the other members of the panel, Jim Free, Nikki, if you have any closing thoughts, now's the time.
I think Jim's absolutely right. I mean, there's such an energy and such an excitement, you know, through the whole community, I think. I mean, certainly at the agency, you know, I used the term just before we were coming out, like, I feel like we're standing in the time before, you know, like we're going to remember this as the time before everything just really happened. And so it's an incredibly exciting time to be at the agency and to be leading science.
Jim Free, you get the last word.
Yeah, boy, it's hard to top those two. I said before we came out here that I had some revelation over the weekend that we're doing what Apollo was asked to do, to take humans to the moon. And we can get caught up in the budget fights or what's this or what's that, but ultimately that's what we've been asked to do. And that is an extreme privilege for me and an extreme opportunity, frankly, for all of us to change history forever.
Thank you, all three of you. Keep it up and onward to the moon and Mars. And please, one more round of applause for our three associate administrators.